is a new normal facing shipping today, which needs to be addressed in order to be successful moving forward. Public demands for ESG are getting a response. Warnings about climate change are being heard. Lending practices are changing. Technology is advancing and other impacts. Are these threats for shipping or an opportunity? We've talked about the decade of defense. We've talked about the decade of digitization, and now we're talking about the decade of decisions. Our new special feature, Chief Correspondent today will be Captain Steve Bomgardner from the Bahamas Maritime Authority. We have on deck Chris Aversano, CMA President, and Q88, Michael Parker, Poseidon Principles, Michael Weber, Weber Research, Sotirios Mamalis, Manager Global Sustainability from American Bureau of Shipping, Joe Hughes, the American Club and Chairman, NAMEPA, and Jeff Pribor, CFO, International Seaways. I want to remind you that after this presentation, we'll have the ship owners panel that follows. So take it away, Captain Steve Bomgardner.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. How amazing is this that this event can reach further than it ever could before? It really is a testament to Carlene and all the wonderful people over at SHIPPINGInsight for putting this amazing event together. So thank you, everyone, from that side. I also wish everyone and their families joining us today good health and happiness. Again, my name is Steve Bomgardner, and I am the Regional Director of Americas for the Bahamas Maritime Authority. Just a little history about us. We are the 7th largest shipping registry in the world. Our commitment to quality and safety is built upon our key values of progress, honor, and service. This is achieved with excellence and innovation in mind, as we are market leaders in passenger vessels, LNG, and the offshore sectors, with over 65 million gross tons, around 1,500 vessels. We have a proud reputation for quality, which is recognized globally as a leading flag in 7 of 10 PSC regimes against all competitors, and whitelisted in low-risk flag status in the Paris and Tokyo MOU, and continued Qualship 21 status. If you could, my presentation, please. Shipping is an internationally governed body by the IMO, with several regulations for protection of environment, such as MARPOL, safety of workers, SOLAS, welfare of shipping professionals, ILO, MLC. So many pose the question, do we really need CSR, ESG? Do those not satisfy the requirements to conduct business ethically and responsibly? Next slide, please. CSR, we've all heard that term, corporate social responsibility. It's a corporate commitment to having a positive impact on employees, consumers, environment, and the wider community. ESG, though, measures these activities to arrive at a more precise assessment of a company's action, and ESG demands metrics. ESG, environmental sustainability governance, is used as a key assessment market for investors. A quarter of the world's professionally managed investment funds now only invest in companies that demonstrate solid ESG credentials. But rather than having ESG as an add-on to business activities, many believe it's essential to really embed ESG at the very heart of a company, especially when it comes to surviving the low carbon transition. Much of the environment issues have been covered and are subject to increasing levels of legislation and regulation from the likes of IMO. The most critical and high-level environment categories can be defined as GHG emissions, energy efficiency, marine pollution, biodiversity, climate risks, scrapping and recycling. The social impact of shipping covers a wide variety of factors, both at sea and on shore. Whilst there are some legislative measures in place, many social issues in shipping require further support and regulation, such as labor rights, health and safety, living and working standards, anti-corruption, and diversity. And the governance part goes towards more procedural, such as anti-corruption, security of assets, transparency with tax and ownership, sanctions, and political interests. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about what we at the BMA and the Bahamas do in respect to CSR and ESG. One of the items that BMA contributes to is the Bahamas Maritime Cadet Corps, with funding to high school students to raise awareness. In addition, the BMA offers annual scholarships for maritime university degrees. We also, during industry contribution, we work with our strategic partners, CLIA, and specifically passenger ships from all flags during the COVID shutdown, where this was to enable ships to shelter in Bahamas water and facilitate crew repatriation. This was a big momentous occasion for some of our partners during this time. And we want to thank them and everyone for their assistance during this unfortunate time that we're going through. We also have the Bahamas Marine Protected Area Network, which has expanded over 6 times to 2 million acres to more than 13 million acres. The marine protected areas have been established with much success in other locations around the world and have proven to have benefits not just for the environment, but for future generations of inhabitants, preserving biodiversity and the means of better future for all. We also implemented the historic Paris Agreement on November 4th, 2016 as a step forward in the fight against climate change. This agreement is now in full effect, meaning that states are bound to curb their carbon emissions in order to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and to preserve efforts to limit the temperature increase even further to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Critically, the special needs of small island development states are preserved in the agreement. Next slide, please. So I would like to now introduce my esteemed panel members, and we'll start moving forward with the discussion. First is Michael Weber. Mike co-founded Weber Research and Advisory in 2019 and has spent the past 13 years in equity research, covering export infrastructure, shipping, and transportation at Wells Fargo and Deutsche Bank. Welcome, Michael. Next is Sotirios Mamalis. Sotirios is the Manager of Global Sustainability of Fuels and Technology at ABS. In this role, he has supported the development of products and services that promote decarbonization of marine and offshore vessels. His work on decarbonization is part of a greater ESG strategy focused on the sustainability of the maritime industry. Welcome. Next is Michael Parker.
Good to be here.
Michael joined Citibank in London in September 1977. He is recently appointed chairman of Citi's global shipping, logistics, and offshore business, having been global industry head since 1997 until now. He is also chairman of the steering committee of the Poseidon Principles, which was launched in New York 2019, and now elected first chairman of the Poseidon Principles Association in 2020. Welcome on board as well. Next is Jeff Pribor. Jeff joined International Seaways in November 2016. International Seaways commenced operations through its predecessor company in 2016 and currently owns and operates a fleet of 39 vessels, including 37 conventional tankers. Prior to International Seaways, Jeff was global head of maritime investment banking and Jefferies at Company Inc. Welcome, Jeff. Joe Hughes. Joe has served as chairman and CEO of the Managers of the American Club and International Group for nearly 25 years. Joe also oversees the activities of Eagle Ocean Agencies, which operates the Eagle Ocean Marine and Eagle Ocean America insurance facilities. Joe is also chairman of NAMEPA, the North American Marine Environment Protection Association, as well as director and a former president of Maritime Association of the Port of New York and New Jersey. Welcome, Joe. And last but not least,
thank you, Steve.
Chris Aversano. Chris is an accomplished maritime executive with over 25 years of experience that combines practical trading with an understanding of how technology impacts the shipping space. Chris is currently product manager at Q88, as well as Chris serves as the president of CMA. He has deep knowledge of the markets and issues surrounding charter party contracts, energy supply and demand, vessel operational issues, sanctions, tariffs, and other external factors. Welcome, Chris. Welcome, everyone, to this amazing panel. So without further ado, I think we should possibly get started here. This first question that I think a lot of people would like to know is going to directly go to Joe. Joe, do you believe shipping is prepared to embrace CSR and ESG goals?
I think it is, although I say that with a degree of caution. I think that uptake in regard to ESG, environmental, social, and governance principle will be patchy, and I think it'll take time. Let me explain what I mean by this. I think there is well, shipping is one of the most diverse sectors in any kind of industry in the world. I mean, it is very, very fragmented. It's enormous in its range and its scope, and it covers a very wide spectrum of different kinds of activities. I think that there is, at the upper end of the shipping hierarchy, a recognition that ESG is the right thing to do. It is part of the corporate, deeply embedded corporate principles that apply to the largest and most sophisticated companies. And I think that it will continue to gain traction in that direction. Then you have another sector of the industry that will want to do the best in the connection of ESG principles, perhaps not with such a high profile as those operators at, as I say, at the higher end of the hierarchy of shipping. But nonetheless, people who take their responsibilities very seriously and will move in that direction as a matter of course over time. But then, of course, you do have a very large sector of shipping, which is more local, perhaps, operators in regional and domestic trades, and also in cultures perhaps that are not as highly attuned to these issues as others might be, where there will be perhaps more resistance, or more particularly a lower sense of urgency in terms of this particular direction. Breaking up ESG into its constituent parts, however, I think that the most important element of this, or at least one that is most widely understood, is the environmental element. And of course, that has been part of the industry consciousness now for, well, decades, really, if you go back far enough, particularly in regard to the initiatives that were taken in regard to oil pollution a long, long time ago, specifically, but more recently in a larger context too. The social impact of things and the governance impact of things are rather more sophisticated. That will be, I think, more a case of being taken up over time. I think that the movement towards recognition and the currency of ESG principles within the industry as a whole will have several impulses. One of which, of course, that I just mentioned is the impulse derived, the endogenous impulse, the impulse that is created by operators wanting to do the right thing and being seen and needing to be seen to be doing the right thing in those particular constituent parts of the ESG profile of their businesses. But I think that another impulse, obviously, must be, if it has been, although it takes time to develop, is the impulse that's created by international legislation. And there, of course, the IMO, as it has had, not only in regard to oil pollution, wreck removal, and all these other relatively recent conventions that have featured on the international stage, but also most recently in regard to IMO 2020 and low sulfur fuels and so on. That will be an important dimension, as mainly in the environmental area, perhaps, going forward. But I think also the work of people like the bankers, and Michael Parker obviously will speak to this specifically, in terms of the Poseidon Principles, is going to be very important indeed in terms of generating support for ESG principles. And equally, I think in our business, in the marine insurance business, a focus from underwriters on the need to be seen as a potential insured, to have concerns about the environment and social and governance issues as a test, as it were, for the appropriateness of providing insurance to these particular operators, will also over time be important. I can say that marine underwriters are taking a greater interest in this particular dimension of their activity now. For example, last week there was a webinar that was sponsored by the International Union of Marine Insurers, IUMI, which many of you will probably be aware of, that involved a number of very important participants in the marine insurance sphere, including Swiss Re, including Garden, our own American Hellenic Hull, which is the American club's hull insurance facility based in Cyprus. That, I think, is going also to be a continuing part of the global drive to create an environment which is much more sensitive to the disciplines of ESG and make the shipping community very much more part of these initiatives.
Thank you for that, Joe. Anyone else from the panel like to chime in on this one?
Well, maybe, Steve, I'll pick up. I think you were going to ask me probably a question about sustainable investments, and I think I can sort of answer that question by the segue that Joe's offered. I actually am less cautious than Joe. I think, and it's partly due to incessant Zoom calls that we've all been able to sit through for the last 6 months, that actually a lot of the thinking and talking on this topic has advanced actually much faster maybe than a lot of the networking might have been in physical conferences, funnily enough. And clearly the visibility to the impact on the environment from less economic activity has only spurred, the Greta Thunbergs of this world into putting more pressure, I think, on politicians in most parts of the world to push forward. I think the reason I'm sort of slightly more bullish possibly than Joe, although I agree with everything he said, and I was on that webinar he's referring to, which I think is a great initiative, because the insurance sector is going to follow the charterers with the Sea Cargo Charter and the banks with the Poseidon Principles in producing, hopefully, its version of measuring emissions. Now, emissions, I think, are going to be the currency of 2021. We will report on the Poseidon Principles. The banks will report our alignment by the end of this year. And we don't know where that's going to be. It's in alignment to the 2050 target of the IMO. But because we know the IMO is going to be tightening those targets anyway, it's all about what evolves over the next few years. Whereas the Sea Cargo Charter is going to have a much more dramatic impact on people like International Seaways, who actually are very forward-thinking. I'll let Jeff talk about that. But it's going to have a direct impact on the employment of vessels in the bulk businesses. So I think everything is going to be measured by emissions. And there's a little bit of Tower of Babel at the moment, whether it is arguing irrelevantly about EEOI or AER and all the other systems. But eventually, you'll pick up your iPhone and you'll get a calculator that will translate different emissions into what, in the end, the consumer wants, the regulators want, right, and investors want. And so we're having this coming together that I think will happen in 2021 in a big way around green principles around shipping that were already there for some other industries, around what the IMO is going to start refining in terms of its standards. And as we publish the Poseidon Principles, as the Sea Cargo Charter increases its signatures.
They came up there, and I thought it was somebody trying to get a note.
That emissions, Joe, you need to go on mute. The emissions, become something that everyone can measure equivalence to. It'll become a competitive aspect. You may recall, if you were present in the Pierre Hotel when we launched the Poseidon Principles in June 2019, that Hugo de Stoop of Euronav said publicly he would publish Euronav's emissions. He's not waiting like many others are not going to wait for a confidential database at the IMO to not reveal what those emissions are. So I think, Steve, industry collectively is moving forward much faster. And I understand Joe's sort of caution, because we're an industry that is not used to collaborating, and there's a lot of collaboration going on. Everyone is used to avoiding the limelight, if you like, and that's all changing. Because what this is actually, I think, going to be about is changing the reputation of shipping and putting shipping in the context of the overall supply chain in a much better light. And what will measure that over the years as we move towards zero emissions is the way in which the industry responds to society's demand for lower emissions and starts to lose that reputation for being a dirty industry. And the other thing, which is you begin to see by a lack of ordering, of course, is that this industry will become profitable on a sustained basis. And Mike Webber will have trouble trying to write about that for many of the companies that he's used to seeing much more red ink or even rare profits only when they sell assets or something. So I think sustainable investment is going to be defined by emissions, and that is in the context of both new vessels and also retrofitting. I think saving emissions by not building ships is going to become also a very important thing next year as we try to measure how retrofitting and the employment of those vessels by the main charterers actually saves emissions for society. And we remove this thing called age from being a defining aspect of shipping, and we measure it by real quality and the technical side. And I'll finish on, if you don't, I know it's very rude in someone else's event to advertise another event, but we are in the middle of Global Maritime Forum Virtual Summit, and its final session, plenary session, is tomorrow morning, I think, for US viewers. It's available on YouTube Live, and I really do recommend people just to dial into that or log on to YouTube, because I think you'll see in that, in a number of key areas, how far the industry has advanced. And then finally, of course, there is an initiative that has been kicked off, led by Shell and others, around US shipping in particular, and how the US can, because of the Jones Act and other things in North America, not lose out to some of these broader global initiatives, which many US players are part of as well, but just recognizing that because of the Jones Act and cabotage, the US is in a slightly different position. So I'm, as I said, very optimistic and very excited that something is happening in a career that I never expected to see actually in my lifetime, and that's why I'm enjoying what I'm currently doing.
Just to if I could, just to piggyback on Michael's comments, we actually incorporated some of the carbon disclosure language from the Poseidon Principles into the ESG scorecard that we produce annually. And to his comments on voluntary corporate participation, we're pleasantly surprised at the level of disclosure we were already seeing, and not just AER data, but EEOI as well, which is a step beyond what's actually required for, I believe, the IMO database. We had 42% of the companies that we incorporate into our scorecard actually disclose some form of carbon emissions. I think the next step would be to establish a baseline and then start to think about ways to drive improvement. But that initial level of participation, we were very pleasantly surprised with. And then just, I don't want to stray too far from the initial question, which I can't even actually remember at this point. But in terms of where the market stands now, and at least what we're seeing, again, to Michael's point, the capital markets are probably the tip of the spear because we're going to be forward-looking. So, maybe some smaller, more regional trades might not be as prevalent in the capital markets. But I certainly think we passed the tipping point at some point in the past year and a half when it comes to both corporates identifying and recognizing kind of a social share at the board level, and making decisions, at least with that share baked into their context and their perspective to some degree. And then when it comes to the capital markets activity, and again, don't want to stray too far, I really do think we've passed an inflection point where when you look at the amount of activity that we're seeing in the market, be it SPACs replacing the IPO, and the majority of those being ESG focused, the kind of capital that's available, and then the capital that's not getting spent right now in the order book as people are looking at with real fear around the obsolescence risk associated with outdated propulsion technology. That's not something we really entertained with a straight face 4 or 5 years ago. And the pace with which we've hit that point, and the pace with which capital is now getting deployed almost exclusively to that arena has really been surprising, even for us. And we've been writing about this for a while. So yeah, I would echo everything that Michael just said.
Captain, would you like me to weigh in from the ship owner operator perspective? I'd be delighted to.
Well, I think we may have actually lost Steve there.
I'd like to hear it, Jeff. How about that?
Thanks, Michael.
I was going to go with the, I know the other question. That sounds like a good idea, Jeff.
Yeah. So the question of sustainability as it affects investment, let me just give a perspective from a ship owner. In my case, we're a tanker company. So I want to say it hits us two ways. The first is sort of year 10 to year 30. If we're looking out from 2030 to 2050, we're really thinking about how much we're going to continue to want to move fossil fuels, whether it's crude oil or refined product, versus since we will hit peak oil somewhere, either it's already happened or it'll happen in 2030, or, take your pick of OPEC, IEA, BP, et cetera. Eventually, we'll probably want to shift to doing something else that uses our management skills, we hope, probably in shipping, maybe moving something a little different. But more relevant for today, because I agree with Michael and Mike Weber and Joe that things are happening very quickly. So in the 0 to 10 year horizon, sustainable investing really is about first retrofitting or other actions investments we can make on the existing fleet to make them more efficient. And secondly, it's about propulsion as it comes to thinking about how we renew our fleet and grow our fleet, because shipping companies, as we know, continually have to invest just to stay even in place. So as we look at where to invest, we're keenly interested in making sustainable investments. But does that mean buying 5 or 7 year old ships and retrofitting them a bit to be sort of efficient until 2030 and having less of a risk of stranded assets? Maybe, but we'd probably prefer to be investing in the future. But since the future propulsion systems are either not there yet, the ones that will make the biggest difference, like hydrogen or even ammonia on the way, not really actionable for us as a company right now. But a transitional fuel like LNG may be the answer, but it's going to take collaboration with our customers. I think it will be really important for International Seaways and other tanker owners to find customers and fuel providers and ports for infrastructure. It's a massive collaboration will be necessary to support us in making a decision to direct our investment, which we need to make somewhere, into more sustainable assets going forward when the future is so uncertain. We want to make investments in that direction, but it'll be much easier if we can collaborate with other participants in the industry to do that.
So I happen to have some thoughts here. I think that sounds like that you feel at this point that the shipping is kind of poised to make the investments, but it would take a lot of collaboration. If you looking at this question, and this is directed to Jeff and Sotirios, if you give sustainability advice about a company's operation and investments, what do you think that would be? Because it kind of dovetails nicely into where we're at right now. Hey, Steve, I just hijacked your thing here. I had the questions in front of me, so I asked them.
No worries. With all the technology, I mean, I literally lost everything. I have no internet now in my home, so I'm on my phone. There's always backups to backups, but thank you for continuing. Sorry everyone for this, but it's just, of course, it happened today. Hasn't happened probably in
Didn't miss a beat.
No problem.
Didn't miss a beat. So
we're a good team.
So to pick up that question, I think we're at, if you want to give advice to the company's operation and investment, we touched a little bit about collaboration, but what do you think else would that be? And I put that question out there.
Excellent.
Sotirios, do you want to take it?
Sure. So specifically about giving advice, giving sustainability advice about a company's operations, investments, I would say I have 3 items in mind. First, build a decarbonization strategy. This means different things, from one company to another. Second, explore long-term improvement options. Jeff previously spoke about year 10 to year 30, and that we think that this is very important to keep in mind. So this is what I mean by long-term. And third, implement an environmental monitoring system on a fleet basis, so that we can track these improvements once they're implemented into the fleet. So I would say we can start from these three pieces of advice. Jeff, would you like to add something to those?
Well, one thing that just occurs to me is that we are focused a lot on the E part of the ESG, and I think that's fine, especially when it comes to investment. That's probably where the greatest challenge is. But my advice might be, don't forget about the S and the G. It's very important to be focused on the safety and well-being of our workers, which most shipping companies are, but to really think of it beyond just our own seafarers and land-based workers, but the entire chain of people that we are in touch with as we do shipping, and being diverse in the workplace and the boardroom is very important as far as governance. So I would advise people to take that very seriously. And in general, that's my advice, is that this is serious. It's not 2 or 3 years ago, one might have argued that this was a nice to have, or, you know, a check the box and be cynical about it if one chose to. I'd like to think, I know the people on this panel have been taking it seriously for years. Let's not forget, ESG is only about 2 or 3 years old as a term. It was CSR before, as you said, Captain, but that's a generation ago. So now it is ESG, and take it seriously, because it's really important to all of your stakeholders. And that means, in my case, since we're publicly listed, it does mean shareholders, but it means capital providers of all kinds. It means our customers, you know, who, for example, Shell's managers are partially evaluated every year for their performance and bonus by ESG principles. So, you know, it's of course they're going to bring that back to providers like ourselves. So take it seriously and realize that all these stakeholders have increasingly effective greenwash detectors. I think, you know, they will sense when you're just making it up. So you better be serious about it. And as an example, I'm glad to hear, Mike, that 42%, you know, hit the mark for the disclosing something about carbon emissions. But I think it has to go further, as you said, to EOI, or certainly get to AER. We went as far as to publish how we're progressing on the trajectory, which is the IMO's trajectories, which is utilized by the Poseidon Principles. Not required by the Poseidon Principles, but utilized. And you know, we showed that we are 1.06. So look at it, glass half full, we're 6% to the bad. We weren't quite there for last year. Look, that's half empty. Glass half full, I'd say we're pretty close. So, but we have to redouble our efforts, because the trajectory is going this way, right? So the target's lower next year. So we know we have to work even harder to get that number lower. And just be transparent about it, and don't pat yourself on the back for what you did yesterday. Be focused on doing even more tomorrow. That would be my advice to certainly to ship owners.
So let me ask you a question. So with all of these platforms and all of these organizations, and you know, everyone getting these scores and scorecards for their vessels and their fleet, you know, I know from our experience, there are a lot of owners that kind of shy away, that they really don't trust all the scoring, or that, you know, if one of their vessels is scored significantly lower, that can affect their charter rates and their fleet. So how, from your company, you know, are there certain items where, you know, you take all of those scoring capabilities and then you basically help understand where your fleet is and moving forward with ESG?
Well, I'll try to be brief and allow room for others to speak. But from our company, I'd say we are very happy with what the shipping industry is doing, whether it's Poseidon Principles or, as Michael referred to, the Sea Cargo Initiative that was just unveiled last week, and all the insurance industry. Joe, you know, is moving, is sensitive to this. So the classification societies bring a lot. So when we look at what we're doing, and particularly in emissions, but in other areas as well, I feel like there's a lot of good effort. It's understandable what we're doing, what's realistic, how to disclose it. What is different and a little difficult, I'll just say it that way, is there's all kinds of outside of the shipping sustainability or ESG ratings going on, whether one likes it or not, it's, I'm not going to name any names, but typically some of those same organizations that rate you will call up and say, by the way, for X dollars a year, I'll be able to advise you on how to get a better rating. So that's a little frustrating. I'm not sure that all those organizations understand the challenges of shipping the way our community does. So I think one of our biggest challenges is working with those outside groups that are not shipping oriented to try to have them appreciate that while we're involved with carrying around fossil fuels, which for a little while, quite a while longer, is going to be necessary, we're doing it in the best possible way from an E, but also an S and G perspective. But I'm really very encouraged, echoing Michael's comments about how the shipping industry itself is embracing monitoring, disclosing, working together to try to get to the right place. So that's
I would add to Jeff's comments that actually, as we've been sitting here, I got a Bloomberg alert around the global green bond market potentially doubling to beyond 2 trillion by 2023. So I think while the metrics aren't perfect, you mentioned a number of groups with different ratings, and it's still early days there. But if you are relying on the capital markets in any way, shape, or form for funding, the advice would be to play ball, because it's not going backwards anytime soon. If you're fully funded, you have the absolute right to do whatever you want. But it's going to become even harder, I think, over time for banks to use their balance sheets, and I'm straying into Michael's fairway here, but or for the credit markets to really extend a significant amount of attractively priced capital to anybody that's not, playing ball here, for lack of a better term.
Totally.
The bank market will follow the capital markets. The pressure from bank regulators through the TCFD work and everything. You see it already. The Dutch banks are publishing their portfolios in terms of alignment to the Paris Agreement of 2015. I don't expect US banks will do that quickly, but the pressure is there. I think all financial markets will coalesce, which was really my point about having a common language around emissions that everyone can use, because then it becomes easier for everyone if we're all speaking the same language.
So, Michael, I ask a question actually of Michael, well, the two Michaels actually. Do you find that this is a universal phenomenon? I mean, do you find that it's mainly in the US and Europe, or equally do you find that Asian banks and financial institutions and ship owners and so on are, cleaving to the same ideas?
Well, let me answer first, and then Mike. I get this question the whole time: when are you going to get a Chinese signatory to the Poseidon Principles? We have one of the big Japanese banks, the largest Japanese bank, has signed. We expect some other Asian signatories. I think a number of institutions are waiting to see our first year results before they sign. But the other thing I think is very significant was President Xi's announcement of net zero for China by 2060. He's taken another 10 years. But I think that is a clear signal that in COP26 in November 21, China will play a very active part around climate change, but it's already signaling that it still wants to preserve that additional period in which it can adapt its economy. So I'm expecting, as a result of that announcement, that once we publish the first year of the Poseidon Principles, that by early next year at some point, a lot more of the Asians, including Chinese, will sign up to all these things.
You're also talking about a country whose the majority of their energy mix still comes from coal, right? So in terms of displacement and decarbonizing that economy, I think there are a number of interim steps there. But I don't want to speak too far out of school, because we are pretty European and U.S. focused. It does seem anecdotally like there's movement there as well. But I think, again, I go back to passing that tipping point when it comes from an investment perspective, and economics being the biggest single driver here. That I find I'm having a hard time expressing how much momentum this has and how all-encompassing it is right now for anybody on my side of the street. Any deal that's getting done, any capital that's getting deployed, you can almost feel it building like a swell in terms of long-dated, long-duration infrastructure capital that's waiting to get deployed into larger scale renewable and decarbonization projects. We see a ton of that stuff before it actually comes to market, or people kind of looking to deploy capital, and the percentage of it that's oriented towards some sort of renewable tech, vast majority, probably north of 90%. Maybe people entertain LNG, but that's usually within a mix that's probably more heavily weighted towards renewables now. It certainly seems from our perspective that the decarbonization push in Europe is certainly more mature than it is in the U.S. I think that the forthcoming election could maybe help change that to some degree. I think it's hard to catch up, but one of the things that's been encouraging to us is that throughout the past 9 months, when most businesses have kind of grinded to a standstill or slowed, that the pace of the decarbonization push in Europe has actually gained momentum. That we've actually seen more details, more granular details around the build out of the a continental hydrogen economy, to the point where we're talking about how many charging stations, natural gas blending targets that are getting particularly granular. That testing starting this year. So I think that the U.S. is still playing catch up. Certainly, Europe seems to be certainly the most mature, but I certainly wouldn't call the Asian markets outliers. And again, I would defer to Michael on that for sure. But we're not seeing a lot of data points to the contrary on any of this right now. Maybe they're lagged a bit, but the pace of improvement there is certainly picking up as well.
Interesting.
Yes, Mike, would you want to hit on that? Which part of the world is the least, that has the least most interest in ESG and sustainability from your perspective?
If you're asking that to me, so from my perspective, Europe, certainly it's it's been around the longest. It's probably more entrenched from an investment perspective. The U.S., if you look at the capital markets deals, even you look at the deals that have gotten done that are in shipping or tangentially related to shipping. We had a deal that attempted to go to market that was, LNG related, but it's effectively facilitating energy transition in frontier states. And that was done at a midpoint of 13 times EBITDA. So the valuations and the capital that are getting deployed, again, I think Europe leading, the U.S. behind, and then I would almost kind of look at the Asian countries as being on maybe a different kind of a different slope, but maybe a different chart, but maybe a steeper slope.
And then South America, would you put them with Americas as in general?
Yeah, it would seem like it's a bit slower, but to be honest, it's not a primary market of focus for us. I mean, we see, again, if you're talking about the decarbonization of frontier states, a lot of times you're talking about displacing diesel-based power gen. So you're talking about a pretty low basis. But anecdotally, when we're watching, say, Brazilian power auctions, almost, renewables are winning those at the moment almost exclusively. And if there is another winner, there might be a single LNG project that gets, or gas to power project that gets awarded in most of these auctions. But certainly within the more developed, countries within South America, I think we're seeing that push as well.
Okay. So for the panel, what do you think the investment? Do you think that they're ready to make the investment to align with the UN sustainable goals? And how much investment will it take for them to reach that?
Well, look, I think the investment is by, there's a lot of investment, it's not all by ship owners. So I alluded to the fact that at International Seaways, we're looking out to fleet renewal and growth and thinking how we can align our investments with sustainability and ESG goals, best achieved with collaboration from customers. But if you're talking about, I would say, if you're talking about, so the investment from a customer might be in a contract to us. It might not be a CapEx. It might be a commitment to a customer like us who's willing to make an investment in hard assets that's more sustainable. And or it may be us providing a letter of intent. That's one of the things we talked about at the Global Maritime Forum that Michael's referring to try to use different fuels so that the fuel providers can make the investments necessary for them to provide sufficient fuel of a new type. So there's investment all through the space that needs to be made.
Okay.
I think the one point, there may be $2 trillion to decarbonize shipping, and it's easy to throw big numbers around. Most of that has to go into land-based infrastructure and distribution.
Right.
And the decision, this is the mistake some people make, the zero-emission vessels can't happen really until that infrastructure is built, or at least the multiple infrastructures that need to be built. So shipping doesn't have to make a one-off decision yet. In fact, no one wants a one-off decision anyway, because as I'm hearing from other meetings I'm in, that the opportunity for tri-fuel vessels to be built now is actually much more realistic than maybe people think. We have to get away from thinking this is a sort of very binary, we're here in the old shipping and then one day we go to zero emissions. It isn't going to be like that, but because shipping has to wait to sort of the back end of that, but regulation starts sooner, we've got to get ready for it. And the best way of getting ready for it is, as Jeff says, all shipping companies do what they can to reduce emissions en route to that when that big investment has come out. There's a lot of arguments about LNG because it's a fossil fuel. Frankly, personally, you have to be pragmatic about this. LNG is going to be there for a good period as the transition fuel. And even though some people don't like it, let's be realistic, it's going to be there until such time as hydrogen or ammonia or something else is able to displace it.
Completely agree with that, Michael.
And I second what Michael said, and just wanted to add investments that are related to alternative fuels, especially infrastructure, distribution, and bunkering, will have to be shared with other elements of the global industry, the stationary power generation industry, the automotive industry, the aviation industry, all this, so we can use them in the future.
It certainly seems like the name of the game for shipping for the foreseeable future is flexibility, and not backing yourselves into a corner on one specific technology. But I would say from our end, and we half of our coverage is now renewables. The biggest single topic of conversation we've had in this quarter and last has been around ammonia, methanol, and hydrogen, right? So building out that infrastructure, what that looks like in terms of likely a high degree of localized production. Certainly, when you talk about displacing bunker infrastructure for merchant fleets, that's still to come. But when you look at the capital that's getting deployed from IOCs and from long-dated infrastructure investors, that's what they're tackling now. So from a shipping perspective, it's get your fleet right, maintain flexibility, don't box yourself in, because there's still this huge unknown in terms of what the dominant fuel source actually ends up being.
From a liability underwriter's point of view, I suppose, the less persistent oil that's being carried around for bunkering purposes, the better.
Well, don't tell Jeff that yet, but we're working on it.
For bunkering purposes.
Bunkering purposes, that's right. Well, it's a fascinating question around what that ultimate infrastructure ends up looking like. It ultimately will likely be distributed in some way, but then that also presents an opportunity in terms of, I think Sotirios mentioned this earlier, in terms of potential co-investment. Finding a solution, an integrated vertical solution to some of these issues. So I think there will be an opportunity for shipping entities to actually play a role in helping to define what that infrastructure looks like.
Actually, I can make another point actually in regard to from the liability underwriter's point of view, the enormous progress that the shipping industry, particularly the tanker industry, has made over the last 30 years in terms of reducing the levels of oil pollution is quite outstanding. I mean, a major oil pollution these days, from a P&I club point of view, is pretty rare. I mean, very rare by comparison with what I can remember in the late 70s and 80s and so on, which is great credit to the industry as a whole, I think.
Certainly seems that way. I mean, we're going to be moving a significant amount of oil for a very long time, so by no means is that market going away. But to Jeff's point around, I think he mentioned revitalizing his fleet with maybe some middle-aged tonnage or tonnage that's maybe 4 to 5 years old to kind of bring down the residual value risk. So staying nimble while keeping your eye on the ball seems like it's the way to go.
And it is a tremendous opportunity. I feel like Michael Parker, not Mike Weber, who's younger, that I wouldn't have guessed that in my career I'd be able to be a part of such a rapid, significant, important for the world transition for our little niche in shipping. It's very exciting, fun.
It's going to change the industry. I mean, my point about profitability is, I think, true. I mean, you can see what's going on in the container sector. by careful management of capacity and a focus on dealing with the environment they work in. And it's, you know, this whole issue of too many ships, too much money, that you and I spoke at many conferences together, Jeff, you know, that'll be a thing of the past when people are talking about emissions and the importance of trucking in terms of its emissions versus the shipping of a particular commodity from Asia to the US or Europe. The language will change.
To that point, I was actually joking around with Rob Perry, who I know many of you know, right before we hopped on this panel. And in terms of the potential investment and the potential opportunity for shipping, if you look at analogs across other modes of transportation, and you look at ground transportation and some of the equities that have been in the market recently, and something like Nikola, which I know has had some negative headlines, but you're talking about, when you're talking about the wholesale shifts in propulsion technology, you ultimately had an entity that had never produced a truck that had a market cap that was larger than Ford's at one point earlier this summer. So when you think about the opportunity from an equity perspective on getting that pivot in propulsion right on the shipping side, I think that the opportunity for investors and for management teams is generational, I think, within the shipping markets. And that's, maybe the froth won't be there by the time we fully transition aviation and marine, but certainly the market is willing to give an awful lot of credit to those that they think are at the forefront.
Yeah, and I think in this discussion we also have all tended to hit more on the environmental side, for the sustainability or the governance side. This, with everything going on with crew change and our responsibility to our seafarers, what do you guys see moving forward is still going to be the biggest step, because we have that responsibility from ship owner, from insurance, from flag, from countries to take care of our people, because that's also involved in ESG, as health, safety, care for your people on board and off board. So what are you guys seeing? What are you guys doing in that respect?
Well, we at the American Club, and I think within the industry at large, and certainly within international group P&I clubs, have very substantial loss prevention initiatives in regard to keeping people safe on board. I mean, that's absolutely key. Our view of a ship owner's eligibility to join a club tends to relate to the quality of the crew that he has, and that's all part of the general picture. And crew care is vitally, vitally important. If you look at some of the major claims, or many of the major claims, in fact, in the insurance business, many of them, if not a majority, are caused by human error. So ensuring that your people on board are well looked after and safe is not just a social imperative. It's an insurance and an imperative that has implications across a very, very wide range of consequences in regard to the enterprise as a whole. So we regard it very highly indeed.
Well, and just from a ship operator's perspective, I knock wood, happy to say that the problem of seafarers being on board for much longer, in large percentages for much longer than their expected tours, is at least improving. So let's hope that the governments of the world manages to not let a second wave of the virus affect us to where that will go the opposite direction. And we shouldn't abandon the idea of making seafarers essential workers, so that becomes easier still and doesn't become a crisis again in 2021. And then we can look forward to not just crisis management, but something that I think we do care very much about, which is sort of the life of the seafarer outside of crisis times like this, and helping them to have a fulfilling career while working on our ships and after. So very, very interested in the S part of the equation. Thank you for asking.
Definitely. And one more piece of information I'd like to add is, since the social aspect of ESG introduces the human element into the landscape, we see efforts of improving the design of vessels from a habitability point of view. And that this means ergonomics. This includes ergonomics, lighting, indoor climate, space, accommodations, entertainment on board, anything that can make the life of the seafarers a little better. Thank you.
Excellent. Well,
Yeah, I think it all comes down to changing the culture across the board. I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges going forward, and it's taking place a lot in the public companies. And I just kind of maybe a little bit of private companies that are self-funded or have a lot of funding, but I think it's happening. But I think that's going to be the biggest impact going forward, and it's very across all three letters of E, S, and G. I think that's going to be the most interesting thing going that we're going to see. That's going to be the biggest material impact on shipping, and it's happening rapidly, as you're saying, at the very high levels. And I'm curious to see how it's going to bleed down over time.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone. So I'm getting messages that our time is up. I want to thank everyone, all my guests on this panel. I want to thank everyone for logging in and viewing today. I'm sorry for the mishap, everyone. I guess, I still have to do some upgrade in my technology. But thank you again. If anyone wants to say any last words, please go ahead.
Thanks for hosting.
Indeed.
Yes, thank you very much.
Indeed.
Thank you very much.
Very much.
Thank you, gentlemen. Well, take it away, Carlene. It's over to you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you to Captain Steve Bomgardner and the Bahamas Maritime Authority and all of the panelists for an excellent conversation about the relationship between public demand and how our industry operates, particularly as it revolves around what we used to, as Jeff Pribor mentioned, call corporate social responsibility, and what we today refer to as environmental, social, and governance practices. And to that end, I just want to mention that as co-founder and executive director of NAMEPA, in addition to my SHIPPINGInsight roles, this past June, NAMEPA launched what we believe is the first sustainability platform for shipping with our CSR ESG sustainability program, where those who go through the program and achieve a certain level of accomplishment in terms of their practices and what they're doing within their organizations receive our maritime sustainability passport. So we're very excited about that platform, and we hope that more of you would be interested in learning more about it. So if you go to the NAMEPA booth, you'll be able to learn more about the CSR ESG program that we've put together.